An 87-year-old homeless woman was humiliated when asking for food in a cafe, but a businessman was shocked when he recognized the necklace she was wearing. It was a cold and rainy morning downtown. The usually bustling streets were deserted, with few people rushing to take shelter from the rain. Mrs. Marissa, an 87-year-old woman, was walking with difficulty, protecting herself as best as she could with an old, worn coat. Her trembling hands held a plastic bag containing all her belongings. Marissa entered the coffee shop, feeling the contrast between the cold street and the warm interior. The smell of fresh coffee and freshly baked cakes filled the air, creating a comforting sensation. She looked around, searching for a place to sit. The tables were occupied by people immersed in their own conversations and activities. Some curious and judgmental glances turned towards her, clearly uncomfortable with her presence. Determined, Marissa headed to the counter. The attendant, a young man with an arrogant look, was busy adjusting his tie and talking with a colleague. When he finally noticed Marissa, he frowned and looked her up and down with disdain. "Do you have money to pay?" he asked in a sharp and scornful tone. "We don't accept charity here." Marissa was paralyzed, feeling her cheeks burn with shame. The attendant's words echoed in her mind, increasing her sense of humiliation. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words failed. Her eyes filled with tears as she tried to hold onto the dignity she had left. At that moment, a tall, well-dressed man who was sitting nearby stood up and approached the counter. It was Ricardo, a successful businessman who frequented the coffee shop daily. He had been observing the situation from the beginning and decided to intervene. With a calm yet firm tone, he addressed the attendant. "I'll pay for her coffee, and please treat all customers with respect," said Ricardo, looking directly into the attendant's eyes. Caught off guard, the attendant was embarrassed. He quickly prepared a coffee and handed it to Ricardo, who then guided Marissa to a table near the window. Ricardo pulled out a chair for Marissa and waited for her to sit down before taking his own seat. "Thank you, sir," said Marissa with a weak but grateful voice. I didn't mean to cause trouble." "Don't worry about it," replied Ricardo with a comforting smile. "Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." Marissa looked at the man in front of her, feeling a bit safer. After a moment of silence, she asked, "What's your name, young man?" "My name is Ricardo," he answered kindly. "And what's your name, ma'am?" "Marissa," she said, giving a slight smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ricardo." As Marissa lifted the cup of coffee to her trembling lips, Ricardo noticed a necklace around her neck. It was a simple necklace, but something about it seemed strangely familiar. He furrowed his brow, trying to remember where he had seen that necklace before, but decided not to ask at that moment, preferring not to disturb the lady more than she had already been. Marissa drank her coffee in silence, feeling a bit more comforted by the unexpected kindness. Ricardo, on the other hand, couldn't get the necklace out of his head. He felt there was more to the story, something that needed to be discovered. Marissa finished her coffee with a serene expression on her face. Ricardo, observing her, noticed that she seemed hungry. Determined to help a bit more, he called the attendant over again, this time in a gentler tone. "Could you please bring a sandwich and some juice?" he asked, ensuring that Marissa would have something to eat. Still embarrassed by the earlier incident, the attendant promptly fulfilled the request. In a few minutes, a simple but nutritious meal was placed in front of Marissa. She looked at Ricardo with eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, Ricardo. You are very kind," said Marissa, beginning to eat slowly, savoring each bite. "There's no need to thank me," replied Ricardo with a smile. "I just want you to be well." As Marissa ate, they talked a bit more. Ricardo asked about how she was doing and how she had come to be in that situation. Marissa shared her story with a mix of sadness and resignation. "I didn't know what I would do today," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I was very hungry, and you appeared like an angel in my life. I don't know how to thank you for that." Ricardo listened attentively, feeling a growing compassion for the woman. The necklace around her neck continued to intrigue his mind, but he didn't want to press her with questions at that moment. After finishing the meal, Marissa wiped her mouth with a napkin and smiled at Ricardo. "You can't imagine how much this meant to me. Thank you, truly," she said. "It was my pleasure to help," replied Ricardo sincerely. "I hope things improve for you, Marissa." Ricardo stood up, ready to go to work. Marissa also stood up, adjusting the plastic bag that carried her few belongings. "Take care, Marissa. I hope to see you again," said Ricardo, offering one last smile before leaving the coffee shop. Marissa waved in response, watching him leave. Ricardo walked towards his office, but his mind was filled with thoughts about the lady he had just met. Throughout the day, as he dealt with meetings and business decisions, the image of the necklace lingered in his mind. Later, when he arrived home, Ricardo sat down in his favorite chair, trying to relax after a long day of work. However, the image of Marissa and the necklace continued to haunt him. He knew there was something familiar about that necklace, something he couldn't quite place. Ricardo picked up an album of old photos, looking for any clue that might help him remember where he had seen that necklace before. The next day, Ricardo woke up with his mind still absorbed by the strange encounter with Marissa. Memories of the elderly woman and the necklace continued to swirl in his thoughts, like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet fit together. After getting dressed and having a quick breakfast, he decided to return to the coffee shop, hoping to find her there again. The walk to the coffee shop was marked by a mix of anxiety and curiosity. Upon entering, he was greeted by the usual aroma of fresh coffee and freshly baked cakes, but his mind was far from the morning routine. He sat at his usual table, ordered a coffee, and began to observe the people around him. While waiting for his coffee to be served, Ricardo distractedly looked out the window. That's when he saw her again. Marissa was outside, standing under the coffee shop's awning, trying to shield herself from the cold wind blowing down the street. She looked even more fragile than the day before, and Ricardo felt a tightness in his heart. He quickly stood up and went to the door. Opening it, he waved at Marissa with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Marissa," he said in a gentle voice. "Please come in. It's very cold out there." Marissa, surprised to see him again, smiled timidly and entered the coffee shop, accepting the invitation. Ricardo led her to the table where he was sitting and pulled out a chair for her. "Thank you, Ricardo," said Marissa with gratitude in her eyes. Ricardo gestured to the attendant, requesting another coffee. They sat in silence for a few moments, enjoying each other's company and the comforting warmth of the coffee shop. Although they didn't say much, there was a tacit understanding between them, a bond slowly forming. The silence between Ricardo and Marissa lingered for a few moments, filled only by the soft sounds of the coffee shop. Ricardo, still intrigued by the figure in front of him, decided to start a conversation. "Mrs. Marissa, if it's not too much trouble, I would like to know more about your story," he said in a welcoming tone. Marissa looked at Ricardo, noticing the genuine curiosity and compassion in his eyes. After a brief sigh, she began to speak, her voice laden with memories. "I was born in a small town in the countryside," she began, a slight nostalgic smile appearing on her lips. "I had a simple but happy childhood. My parents were farmers and worked hard to support us. We had little, but we were a close-knit family." Ricardo listened attentively as Marissa continued, describing her youth with affection. She talked about the fields where she played, the town's traditional festivals, and the friends she made over the years. "I remember the June festivals, when the whole town would come together to dance and celebrate," she said, her eyes sparkling as she reminisced. "I loved those nights. They were simpler, happier times. When I was 18, I met Alejandro, said Marisa, her eyes glowing with a mix of joy and sadness. He was a hard-working and very caring young man. We fell in love quickly and soon got married. It was a wonderful time, full of dreams and hopes. Ricardo smiled, imagining a young and in love Marisa living a life full of promise. Marisa continued, telling about the early years of marriage when she and Alejandro worked hard to build a life together. Alejandro was a mason, and I sewed to help with the expenses, she explained. We worked hard and bought a small house. We lived modestly, but we were happy. We spent many years like that, supporting each other in everything. Marisa paused for a moment, her eyes distant, reliving the happy memories alongside her beloved. Ricardo remained silent, respecting the moment and allowing her to continue when she was ready. But, as life tends to do, challenges arose, she finally said with a deep sigh. Alejandro fell seriously ill a few years ago. It was a very difficult time. He was the pillar of our family, and seeing his health deteriorate was devastating. Marisa's voice trembled slightly as she spoke about the loss of her husband. Ricardo noticed the pain she still carried and felt deep respect for her resilience. We did everything we could, but unfortunately, he passed away, continued Marisa, sadness in her eyes. After Alejandro's death, things started to fall apart. Without him, it was hard to keep everything going. Every day was a struggle, but I tried to continue, clinging to the memories of the good times we spent together. Ricardo felt a wave of compassion rising within him. Marisa had faced so many hardships, yet she had found the strength to carry on. He knew there was more to her story, but he decided not to press her to talk about the necklace or the details of how she ended up on the street. Mrs. Marisa, your story is inspiring. Your strength and resilience are remarkable, said Ricardo sincerely. Thank you for sharing that with me. Marisa smiled, feeling valued and understood. The bond between them was strengthening with each moment, despite the unspoken words and untold stories. Ricardo found himself reflecting on his own life and the challenges he had faced. He felt a deep admiration for Marisa and a growing desire to help her. He knew that, in some way, fate had crossed their paths, and he was determined to make a difference in her life. After a moment of silence, Ricardo, still intrigued by the figure in front of him, decided to start the conversation again. Mrs. Marisa, if it's not too much trouble, I would like to know more about your story, he said in a welcoming tone. Marisa looked at Ricardo, noticing the genuine curiosity and compassion in his eyes. After a brief sigh, she began to speak, her voice laden with memories. After Alejandro passed away, things became very difficult, she began, her voice trembling. The bills started piling up. First it was the medical expenses, then the rent, food. It seemed like everything was falling apart at the same time. Ricardo listened attentively, feeling a tightness in his heart for Marisa. He could not imagine how difficult it must have been for her to handle all this alone. I did my best to keep everything in order, but each month the debts just kept growing, Marisa continued, looking at her aged hands. Before I knew it, the bank was taking my house. I lost everything, Ricardo. All my belongings, my security, my home, everything was gone. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. During that time, my daughter was a great help at home. She was a strong and determined young woman, and she did everything she could to support us, said Marisa, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and sadness. But 3 years after Alejandro's death, my daughter fell gravely ill. I did everything I could to take care of her, but the disease was too strong. Ricardo felt a lump in his throat as he heard this. The loss of her husband was already devastating, but losing a daughter shortly afterward was an unimaginable pain. My daughter was the light of my life, Ricardo, Marisa continued, her voice choked with emotion. This necklace is the only thing I have left of her. It's my most precious memory. She was everything to me, and losing her was like losing a part of myself. Ricardo was shocked by Marissa's story. His mind was filled with confused and painful thoughts, but one question stood above all. Who was Marissa's daughter? He needed to know. Gathering courage, he asked with a trembling voice, "Mrs. Marissa, if it's not too much trouble, could you tell me your daughter's name?" Marissa sighed deeply before responding. "Her name was Sophia," she said with a glint in her eyes that reflected both love and pain. Sophia was a wonderful young woman, full of life and dreams. Ricardo felt his heart race. The name echoed in his mind, bringing up memories he had deeply stored away. Trying to remain calm, he asked more about the necklace. "This necklace, you mentioned it is a precious keepsake. Does it have any special significance?" Marissa nodded, gently touching the necklace around her neck. "This necklace opens," she explained. "Inside it, there's a small picture of Sophia. It's one of the few things I have left of her." Ricardo, feeling a mix of hope and dread, hesitantly asked, "Could you show me the picture, please?" Marissa looked at Ricardo, sensing the urgency in his voice. With trembling hands, she opened the necklace and revealed the small photo inside. Ricardo stared intently at the image, and the world around him seemed to stop. There was Sophia, with that radiant smile he knew so well. He began to tremble, and tears started to stream down his face. "Sophia," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "Sophia Rodriguez." Marissa, astonished, looked at Ricardo with wide eyes. Yes, she responded quickly. "Rodriguez was Alejandro's surname that Sophia carried. Did you know my daughter?" Ricardo began to weep intensely, the pain and longing he had stored for so long finally being released. "Sophia," he repeated, struggling to find the right words. "I gave her that necklace. I was dating Sophia. This necklace was the first and only gift I managed to give her." Marissa was shocked, her world spinning with the revelation. She looked at Ricardo in disbelief. "No, it can't be," she said, her voice trembling. "Is this real? How is this possible?" Ricardo, still crying, looked at Marissa with profound sadness in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Marissa," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I couldn't attend Sophia's funeral. That very week, I was on a business trip in another country. When I found out about Sophia's death, I couldn't return in time for a last goodbye." Marissa felt a wave of sadness and compassion for Ricardo. She knew what it was like to lose someone so important and saw that he also carried a heavy burden. "We were planning," Ricardo continued, his voice broken by emotion, "for me to meet you, Marissa. Sophia wanted me to meet her mother to approve our relationship since her father had died a few years ago." Marissa looked at Ricardo, recognizing the sincerity in his words. She tried to absorb the magnitude of what she had just heard. Ricardo and Sophia were in love, planning a future together, and now he was before her, carrying the same sorrow. "My daughter was the light of my life, Ricardo," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "This necklace is the only thing I have left of her. It's my most precious keepsake. She was everything to me, and losing her was like losing a part of myself." Ricardo looked at Marissa, understanding the depth of her pain. Tears rolled down his face as he processed the impact of the revelation. Sophia had been an essential part of their lives, connecting them in a way neither could have ever imagined. Silence took over the coffee shop as the two processed the revelation. The shared pain, the memory of Sophia, and the destiny that had brought them together at that moment created an unbreakable bond between them. Ricardo knew he needed to do something to help Marissa. The story of Sophia, the pain they shared, and the inexplicable connection he felt with Marissa drove him to take concrete action. Ricardo, still in tears, looked at Marissa with increasing determination. He knew he couldn't let the situation continue as it was. "I can't let this continue, Mrs. Marissa," he said, his voice still choked with emotion. "I can't see you suffer like this. I need to do something." Marissa looked at him with eyes full of surprise and confusion, trying to understand what he was about to say. "You know," continued Ricardo, wiping away the tears, "since Sophia's death, I've never dated anyone else. And I won't. What I felt for her, I'll never feel for anyone else. She was unique, irreplaceable." He paused, taking a deep breath to calm his emotions. "I live alone in a large apartment. It's warm and comfortable. Money has never been a problem for me. My parents, who have passed away, left me a successful company, and I've always had everything I needed, except Sophia. And now you, Marissa, are the only thing that can bring me back to the memories of the happy times I spent with her." Marissa was silent, absorbing every word. She felt the weight of Ricardo's emotions and the sincerity in his request. "I ask you to come live with me in my apartment," said Ricardo, his voice filled with hope and sincerity. "You will be like a mother to me after all. You are the mother of the woman of my life." Marissa hesitated. The idea was overwhelming. She never imagined that someone would care so much as to offer something like this. But the sincerity in Ricardo's eyes, the respect and pain he shared, made her reconsider. She felt that perhaps, just perhaps, this was a chance for both of them to find some peace and comfort. "Ricardo, I don't know what to say," began Marissa, her voice trembling. "This is very generous of you, but I don't want to be a burden to you." "You won't be a burden," said Ricardo, holding Marissa's hands firmly. "On the contrary, you'll be company, a family. Please, let me do this for you, and for Sophia." Marissa felt a wave of emotion, her resistances slowly dissolving. Finally, she nodded, accepting the proposal. "All right, Ricardo," she said with a small smile. "If this is really what you want, I accept." Ricardo smiled, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in years. He immediately began planning Marissa's move. The next day, they went shopping, and Ricardo bought new clothes for Marissa. He wanted her to feel comfortable and welcomed in her new home. As they chose clothes, Marissa felt a bit uncomfortable with all the attention, but Ricardo constantly reassured her. "I want you to feel at ease, Mrs. Marissa. You deserve all the comfort and happiness." Marissa, with eyes shining with gratitude, finally began to accept the new reality. As the days passed, Marissa and Ricardo started to create a routine together. Marissa's presence brought a sense of home to Ricardo's apartment, and Ricardo's company gave Marissa new purpose and security. They spent many evenings talking about Sophia, sharing memories and stories, laughing and crying together. The bond between them strengthened, transforming their pain into a new type of family. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about what you thought of the story. A big hug, and see